Let's run an experiment. Take every single reason people have ever given for why a computer needs to run Windows, list them out one at a time, and check them against one specific machine. A $199 laptop built by a small employee-owned company in Colorado called System 76. If Windows is genuinely necessary, this laptop should fail somewhere on that list. It shouldn't be able to handle real work, real software, real gaming, real professional use without Windows sitting underneath it somewhere. So let's actually go through the list point by point and see what happens. Because what we're about to find is that it doesn't fail anywhere. And that's exactly why this laptop matters a lot more than its specs alone would suggest. Before we start checking boxes, it's worth being clear about why this audit approach is actually the fairest way to test a claim like, you need Windows, rather than just another opinion piece arguing for a side. Claims about necessity are testable in a way that claims about preference simply aren't. If someone says Windows is their favorite operating system, that's a preference, and there's nothing to check it against. Preferences are just true by definition for the person holding them. But necessary is a factual claim about capability, and factual claims about capability can actually be tested against real evidence, category by category, the same way you test any other engineering claim. That's exactly what this video is going to do, as honestly and specifically as possible, rather than just asserting a conclusion and hoping it sounds convincing. Let's start with the most basic requirement first, the thing almost every computer on the planet gets used for. Everyday general computing. Web browsing, email, video calls, streaming, word processing, spreadsheets, basic photo editing. This is the baseline every operating system has to clear before anything else even matters. And it's the category where you need Windows has always sounded the most obviously true, simply because Windows has handled this baseline reliably for so long that most people never had reason to question whether anything else could too. System 76's laptops run Linux distributions built specifically around this exact use case, with LibreOffice for documents and spreadsheets pre-installed and ready immediately, GIMP available for photo editing, and every major browser, Firefox, Chrome, Brave, running natively with full compatibility. Video calls work through the same browser-based tools most people already use regardless of operating system, since services like Google Meet and most modern conferencing platforms run entirely in the browser and genuinely don't care what operating system is underneath. Check this box off. There's nothing on this list that requires Windows specifically, and hasn't for years. Now let's move to professional and development work, because this is where System 76's actual core customer base lives, and it's a much higher bar to clear than basic web browsing. Developers need compilers, container tools, command line environments, version control, and compatibility with the servers and cloud infrastructure their code will eventually run on. Here's the twist that a lot of people miss. Linux isn't just adequate for this category, it's often the preferred environment because the vast majority of servers and cloud infrastructure in the world already run on Linux. Developing directly on a Linux machine means developing in an environment that matches production far more closely than developing on Windows ever did, even with the compatibility layers Microsoft has built specifically to bridge that gap. Data scientists get native support for Python, R, and every major machine learning framework, often with better out-of-the-box performance than a comparable Windows setup, because those tools were built by and for a community that skews heavily toward Linux in the first place, and package managers make installing and updating that entire scientific computing stack a matter of a single command rather than hunting down individual installers. Check this box off too. And in this specific category, the necessary argument doesn't just fail, it arguably runs backward. There's also a knock-on effect worth mentioning briefly in this category. Developer usage trends more broadly. Independent surveys of software developers have consistently shown Linux as either the primary or secondary operating system for a majority of respondents in recent years. When the people actually building the software the rest of us use are increasingly working in Linux environments day to day, that shapes what gets built, what gets tested well, and what compatibility gets prioritized going forward. A self-reinforcing cycle that runs in exactly the opposite direction of the one that used to favor Windows by default. Let's talk about the category that used to be Windows' single strongest, most defensible advantage, gaming. For most of the last 2 decades, you need Windows carried an unspoken but very real asterisk. You need Windows, especially if you ever want to play modern video games, because gaming on Linux was genuinely, legitimately impractical for the average person. That asterisk has quietly disappeared. Valve's Proton compatibility layer, combined with the runaway success of the Steam Deck, has made Linux gaming a real mainstream viable option rather than a compromise reserved for a handful of dedicated enthusiasts willing to fight with configuration files. Steam's own hardware survey has repeatedly shown Linux gaming share climbing well past levels that would have sounded implausible just 5 years ago. And that shift alone has done more to weaken the old "you need Windows" assumption among casual, non-technical users than any government migration or enterprise policy change ever could. Because gaming is exactly the kind of everyday, high-stakes use case that ordinary people actually test the claim against personally. It's not perfect parity. Some games with aggressive anti-cheat systems still don't run properly on Linux, and that's a real, honest limitation worth naming rather than glossing over. But for the overwhelming majority of the Steam library, gaming on Linux today works close enough to seamlessly that most players never notice a difference. Check this box mostly off, with one honest asterisk remaining. Now for the category that used to be Linux's biggest, most legitimate weakness for decades: hardware compatibility. This is worth spending real time on, because it's the category System 76 was specifically founded to solve, and understanding why makes the rest of this list make more sense. For most of Linux's history on the desktop, the operating system software could work perfectly fine and still get undermined by hardware. The manufacturer never tested or optimized for it. Wi-Fi cards without working drivers, trackpads that registered clicks incorrectly, graphics, chips that wouldn't wake up properly from sleep. That was a genuinely fair criticism for a long time, not corporate propaganda. System 76's entire founding premise was to attack that specific problem head-on, build and sell hardware where every single component is chosen and configured specifically to work flawlessly with Linux, rather than hoping generic Windows-oriented hardware happens to cooperate. The specific machine we're auditing today is a direct product of that 20-year effort. The Lemur Pro's Wi-Fi 7 chipset, its Thunderbolt 4 ports, its trackpad, its keyboard backlighting, its fingerprint reader if the configuration includes one, every one of those components was selected by System 76 engineers specifically because Linux driver support for it was known to be solid, tested internally, before the laptop ever reached a customer. That's a fundamentally different process than installing Linux onto hardware designed and validated primarily for Windows, which is still where most of Linux's remaining hardware compatibility reputation problems come from. 20 years of doing exactly this, consistently, across an entire evolving product lineup, is why System 76's customers report the kind of smooth, plug-and-play experience that used to be considered nearly impossible to find on Linux hardware. Check this box off, not because Linux hardware compatibility solved itself everywhere, but because a company specifically decided to solve it completely within its own product line. Let's check one more category before moving to the honest weak points: overall software polish and long-term commitment. This is worth including specifically because it's the category that separates a company just tolerating Linux from a company genuinely betting its future on it. System 76 doesn't just install a stock version of an existing Linux distribution on their hardware and call it finished. They've spent years building their own desktop environment from scratch, called Cosmic, designed specifically for their machines and increasingly available across the broader Linux ecosystem. Building a desktop environment means designing and maintaining the window manager, the settings panels, the file browser, the notification system, the app launcher, and dozens of other pieces of software most people never think about individually but rely on constantly. System 76 went further still, rewriting core parts of that experience in Rust, a modern, security-focused programming language, specifically to make it fast, stable, and genuinely polished rather than a rough afterthought. A company doesn't make that kind of sustained, expensive software investment unless it's confident in the platform's long-term viability. Check this box off, and it's a category that, notably, most casual Linux hardware sellers wouldn't even attempt, which is exactly what separates a genuine proof of concept from a company simply riding a trend. Now let's check the category of security and update transparency, because this one matters enormously given everything we've covered on this channel about Windows 10's end-of-support fallout and the ongoing secure boot certificate mess. Linux distributions generally receive regular, predictable security updates, often with longer support windows than a typical consumer Windows release, and without the hardware-based cutoffs that left millions of working Windows 10 machines suddenly unsupported last October. There's no equivalent to Windows 11's TPM chip requirement locking out otherwise capable hardware from receiving security patches. Update processes tend to be more transparent too. Package managers show you exactly what's being updated and why, rather than bundling changes into an opaque update that sometimes changes settings or reintroduces features you'd previously turned off. Check this box off, and in a specific sense, ahead rather than merely equal. Here's a category worth being honest about, because a fair audit means acknowledging where the old assumption still has some real footing. Ease of use for complete newcomers with zero technical background. Windows still benefits enormously from decades of institutional familiarity, corporate IT training, computer literacy classes, informal tech support from friends and family, all built around Windows conventions passed down almost like folk knowledge, from one generation of computer users to the next. A total beginner sitting down at a Linux machine for the first time will encounter some genuinely different conventions, even on the friendliest, most beginner-oriented distributions. That gap has narrowed dramatically over the past several years. Distributions like Linux Mint and Zorin OS are explicitly designed to feel immediately familiar to Windows switchers, and System 76's own Cosmic desktop environment was built with exactly that kind of approachability in mind. But it would be dishonest to claim the gap has fully closed to zero. This is the one box on the list that stays partially unchecked, and it's worth naming directly rather than pretending otherwise. Let's check enterprise and institutional use, because this is where the "you need Windows" claim has historically had its deepest, most entrenched roots. Not because of any specific technical requirement, but because of decades of accumulated organizational momentum. Corporate IT departments standardized almost universally on Windows, not necessarily because they'd run rigorous comparisons against alternatives, but because doing anything else meant swimming against an entire industry's default assumptions. Hiring practices built around Windows-specific certifications, enterprise software built and tested primarily for Windows environments, and IT support staff trained almost exclusively on Windows troubleshooting. Choosing anything else wasn't just a technical decision, it was an organizational risk because it meant stepping outside decades of accumulated institutional muscle memory. And this is exactly the category where the evidence against the old assumption has gotten hardest to dismiss this year. Germany has spent recent years migrating tens of thousands of official government workstations away from Microsoft software and toward Linux and LibreOffice, with the explicit goal of reducing dependency on any single foreign technology vendor. Denmark has run a parallel initiative across its own public sector. Switzerland went further still, passing legislation requiring publicly funded software development to default to open source licensing, alongside investment in a sovereign national cloud infrastructure built independently of the big American tech platforms. These aren't small pilot programs run by a handful of enthusiastic civil servants. They're large, budget-backed, multi-year commitments made by entire governments. Check this box off, with real institutional weight behind it, rather than just enthusiast anecdotes. Now let's check cost, because this is where the old assumption gets tested in a way that actually cuts in an interesting direction. One worth being precise about rather than oversimplifying. It's true that Linux itself is free, with no licensing cost, while Windows requires either a license fee baked into a new PC's price, or increasingly a Microsoft 365 subscription for full functionality of tools that used to come free with the operating system, like the now discontinued WordPad, which shipped with every copy of Windows for 28 years before quietly disappearing from Windows 11's most recent update. But System 76's hardware isn't cheap. Their laptops start at $1,999, squarely in premium territory, not a discount option. That's actually the more interesting finding here, not a strike against the case. It proves that the value proposition isn't Linux because it's free, which would just be Linux, as the budget option people have dismissed for decades. It's Linux because it's genuinely excellent, with customers paying full premium price specifically for the hardware quality and software experience together. Check this box off in a more sophisticated way than a simple price comparison would suggest. Real demand exists at real prices, which is a stronger proof point than a discount option ever could be. So let's tally up the audit. General computing, check. Professional and development work, check, arguably ahead. Gaming, mostly check, with one honest asterisk around specific anti-cheat systems. Software polish and long-term commitment, check, evidenced by an entire custom desktop environment built from scratch. Hardware compatibility, check, specifically because a company built it. Its entire business solving that exact problem. Security and updates, check. Arguably ahead given everything we've covered about Windows 10's hardware-locked end-of-support deadline. Ease of use for total beginners, partially checked, the one honest gap remaining. Enterprise and institutional adoption, check, backed by real government commitments rather than just enthusiast anecdotes. Cost and value, check, and in a more interesting way than a simple price comparison suggests. Out of 9 major categories, 8 check out completely and 1 checks out partially. That's not a hedge or a marketing spin. That's what an honest audit of the actual evidence produces. It's worth pausing on why running this audit as a checklist, rather than just making a sweeping claim, actually matters for how convincing the conclusion should be. Sweeping claims are easy to dismiss because they can be waved away with a single counterexample. Well, what about gaming, or, well, what about hardware support is often enough to end the conversation before it starts, precisely because those objections used to be completely valid. A category-by-category audit doesn't allow for that kind of easy dismissal, because each objection has to be checked individually against current verifiable evidence rather than decade-old assumptions. Once you've actually gone through gaming and confirmed it mostly works, and gone through hardware compatibility and confirmed it's been specifically solved, and gone through enterprise adoption and confirmed real governments are doing it at scale, the old reflexive objections stop functioning as conversation enders. They become questions with actual checkable answers, and the answers, category by category, keep landing in the same place. It's worth being fair here and stepping back from the framing for a second, because a genuinely honest audit has to acknowledge what this does and doesn't prove. This doesn't mean Windows is a bad operating system, or that everyone should switch tomorrow, or that Microsoft's business is about to collapse. Windows still runs the overwhelming majority of desktop and laptop computers worldwide, and that dominance isn't disappearing because of one company's laptop lineup, however impressive. What this audit actually proves is narrower and, in a lot of ways, more interesting. That necessary was always the wrong word. Windows has been the default, the most popular choice. The path of least resistance reinforced by decades of institutional momentum. All of that is true and remains true. But default and necessary are not the same claim, and System 76 is exactly the kind of sustained, credible, category-by-category evidence that finally makes that distinction impossible to ignore. It's worth understanding how completely the necessary framing came to dominate the popular imagination in the first place, because it didn't happen by accident. Through the 1990s, as the IBM-compatible PC became the standard hardware platform for the entire industry, Microsoft made sure Windows was the software layer sitting on top of nearly all of it, through licensing deals with manufacturers that made shipping a PC without Windows commercially difficult, and through relentless competition against rival operating systems that mostly ended the same way: Windows absorbing the market. That dominance drew real legal scrutiny too. In the late 1990s, the US government pursued a major antitrust case against Microsoft, centered on allegations that the company had used its market position to squeeze out competing software, most famously by bundling Internet Explorer directly into Windows in a way that made it difficult for rival browsers to gain a foothold, regardless of their actual quality. Dominance that required that level of active defense to sustain was never quite the purely merit-based inevitability it was marketed as. That history matters for this audit, because it means the necessary framing was, in real and legally documented ways, actively built and defended, not simply a natural conclusion reasonable people arrived at independently by comparing every option fairly. That distinction matters for how this audit should actually be read. This isn't an argument that Microsoft built a bad product and got lucky. Windows has been, by most honest measures, a genuinely capable and successful operating system for most of its history. That's part of why it earned its dominant position in the first place. The point of this audit isn't to attack Windows quality, it's to attack the specific word necessary, which was never really a claim about quality at all. A product can be excellent, successful, and the default choice for 30 years running, and still not be necessary in the strict sense of being the only option genuinely capable of doing the job. Those are two entirely different claims, and conflating them is exactly what let the word necessary survive unchallenged for as long as it did. It's also worth situating System 76 within the broader Linux hardware landscape this year, because they're no longer quite as alone as they used to be in making this exact case. Dell has continued selling its XPS line with Ubuntu pre-installed as an official configuration option, not a hobbyist workaround. Lenovo has expanded official Linux certification and support across parts of its ThinkPad lineup, a brand historically associated almost entirely with corporate Windows deployments. Framework, the increasingly popular modular and repairable laptop maker, ships Linux as a fully supported first-class option across its product range. None of these companies are abandoning Windows as their primary business, but watching mainstream manufacturers gradually normalize what System 76 spent 2 decades. Proving in relative obscurity tells you this audit's results aren't a fluke specific to one small company. They're becoming the industry's own quiet consensus, one product line at a time. There's also a generational dimension worth naming, because it explains why this audit's results are unlikely to be a temporary blip. People who grew up with Windows as the unquestioned default absorbed an entire mental model of computing built around that assumption. Certain keyboard shortcuts, certain file structures, certain expectations about how software gets installed and updated, all quietly shaped by decades of Windows being the only real option most people ever encountered. Younger users entering the workforce today have a meaningfully different relationship with it. Many of them grew up using Chromebooks in school, which run a Linux-based operating system without that fact ever being prominently advertised, and increasingly do serious computing work through browser-based tools and cloud services that genuinely don't care what operating system sits underneath them. For a growing share of new computer users, you need Windows was never something they personally experienced as inevitable in the first place. It's simply one option among several they've encountered, with no automatic authority behind it just because it used to be repeated so often. That generational shift matters for this specific audit because it changes who's actually running it. A person who's used nothing but Windows their entire life has to actively unlearn an assumption before they can even consider testing it fairly. A person entering computing today, raised on browser-based tools and Chromebooks, doesn't have that same unlearning step to go through. They can run this exact audit with genuinely fresh eyes, no inherited assumption weighing down the results before they even start. Checking boxes. That's precisely the kind of audience System 76 and the broader Linux hardware ecosystem are increasingly winning over, not through aggressive marketing, but simply by being a credible, well-built option sitting there, waiting for anyone willing to actually run the comparison, honestly. So here's what this audit actually adds up to, stated as plainly as possible. Not that Windows is bad, or dying, or about to lose its market position next year, but that the specific word necessary, the idea that computing simply requires Windows the way a car requires wheels, doesn't survive a category-by-category examination against real, shipping, 20 years and counting evidence. Windows remains the default. It remains the most familiar option for a huge number of people. It remains, for total beginners, genuinely a bit easier to pick up given decades of institutional familiarity. None of that is the same claim as necessary, and once you've actually run this audit honestly, category by category, that gap between default and necessary becomes impossible to unsee. It's worth thinking about what happens next, now that this gap has been made this explicit. An assumption that's simply repeated tends to survive as long as nobody bothers to actually check it. An assumption that's been checked category by category against real evidence and found wanting in 8 out of 9 cases doesn't get to quietly go back to being an unquestioned default again. That's really the lasting significance of a company like System 76 existing for 20 straight years at full premium price. It doesn't just provide one more anecdote to add to a pile. It provides exactly the kind of sustained, verifiable evidence that makes an honest audit like this one possible in the first place. Every year, System 76 keeps shipping as another year this specific audit gets easier to run and harder for anyone to honestly dispute. If you've ever looked at Linux hardware and assumed you'd have to settle for weaker specs, worse compatibility, or a rougher experience compared to a mainstream Windows machine, System 76 2026 lineup is worth an honest look. The Lemur Pro alone stacks up against flagship ultra-portables costing the same or more, and it passed every category on this list except one. And if you want to see the full picture of why so many people are running this exact audit for themselves this year, I've got the full breakdown of the Windows 10 migration wave linked right here, along with the other stories we've covered about Microsoft's own products quietly underserving Linux users at every turn. The Teams lockout, the secure boot certificate mess, Copilot's broken sidebar on Edge for Linux, taken together, they show exactly how a 50-year-old assumption starts failing its own audit, one category at a time. If you've run your own version of this audit, for work, for gaming, for anything else, let me know in the comments how it turned out, and which category, if any, actually held you back. That kind of real-world testing is worth more than any single video's conclusion, this one included. Subscribe if you want to keep watching exactly how much of that old assumption keeps getting tested and keeps not holding up.